is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and this is a wrap-up of 3 months worth of books that goes back to the end of 2021. This is September, October, and November. Those were 3 months during which I read a number of other things that I have already wrapped up in other wrap-ups. So this is the remaining odds and ends, and this is going to be 4 books. If you're wondering why I've been relatively absent on this channel recently, mostly the answer is that I've just been occupying myself with other hobbies that I'm enjoying very much, so I'm not particularly inclined to apologize for it. However, I have also done some video content in other places other than this YouTube channel that if you have missed me, you might want to check out. I participated in a reaction live stream with the Stitch and Bitch crew on my friend Rachel's channel, Kalanati. We talked about the Hugo shortlist for 3 hours straight, and by the end of it, our brains were absolutely melting. But if you want 3 hours of that, I will link the recording of that live stream down below. I have also been fiddling around with TikTok, so I have made some book talk content. My intention has never been for that to overtake the YouTube channel. I'm not making redundant content, like I'm not doing reviews and wrap-ups or anything over there. I'm not doing the same types of videos I do on the YouTube channel. However, the learning curve of like figuring out the basics of a brand new platform has sapped some energy from me that would normally go into doing booktube content over the last several months. I'm not making a prolifically large amount of videos over on TikTok, and I'm still experimenting with what works for me over there, but I am also at The Fancy Hat Lady Reads on TikTok if you want book talk content from me occasionally. So I think that's all of the announcements over with, and I'm going to start talking about a book that I finished reading in September, but had actually started reading several months before. I got very close to the end and like freaked out by how very high stakes the end was getting, and I got worried about the ending, and I set it aside, like just really ridiculously close to the end, and it took a while for me to be like sure enough that I wanted to read the end to pick it up and read it, and then it was fine. It was totally fine. I had nothing to worry about. Anyways, the book was The Beast Player by Nahoko Uehashi. This is a bind-up of the first 2 shorter novels in this series translated from Japanese. The 2 books that are in this, as far as I can tell, are the first story arc of this series. They belong together, and then the second, I think it's 2 more books, are in the second English volume, which is called The Beast Warrior, which I have but have not yet read. These are published as YA, at least in the United States, even though they don't necessarily map neatly on to how the American publishing industry usually defines the parameters of YA. The protagonist grows up from a young child to an adult over the course of this first book, and she is presumably an adult throughout the entire second book, which I haven't read, but this book is very much a coming-of-age story. It is a sort of veterinary fantasy about a character whose calling is caring for these magical creatures, but while it's like very slow-paced and pastoral in a lot of the middle, it does start out very high stakes and then it ends very high stakes as well, with a bunch of politics that are sort of introduced earlier on in the book but kept on the back burner, and then the political situation gets very high stakes towards the end. This pacing was strange for me, and I wonder if it's a sort of product of the fact that this is a bind-up of 2 books. Presumably they're books that are meant to be read back to back. If the break is where I think it is, then like book 1 ends in the middle of something very important happening that's picked up immediately in book 2. That's assuming that they haven't changed where they're labeling the first and second halves in the English version, which I don't know for a fact. But still, the fact that some of the sections of this book feel very different from other sections of the book may turn away some readers. Overall, though, I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars. It's about a girl named Ellen, spelled E-L-I-N, and she lives in a kingdom that is both politically and geographically divided between the place where the government is headed and the rulers of the country are committed to non-violence as part of their ethos and creed. And then the military branch of the government, which is based in a separate part of the kingdom and is responsible for defending the kingdom, given that the rulers are forbidden from dirtying their hands. There are also 2 different species of large, fantastical, magical beings. At the beginning of this book, Ellen lives with her mother, who works as a keeper for the Toda, which are the water sea serpent type creatures that are used by the military. Disaster befalls the Toda in her mother's care, and so her mother is sentenced to death and Ellen has to flee. And it's all very traumatizing. She is then taken in and raised by a man who is a beekeeper, and while studying under him, she becomes both a skilled musician and an animal behavior enthusiast, a particular pair of skills that will lead her to some important discoveries regarding the nature of both the Toda and the royal beasts. The royal beasts are the other type of magical creatures. They are kept by the royal family, and they are like giant winged wolves. And Ellen eventually finds her calling working with the royal beasts, and she develops a very special bond with a royal beast named Leland. There are at least 2 other point of view characters who don't get nearly as much page time as Ellen, but you start getting their chapters very occasionally, very early on, who are involved with the politics of this kingdom. And it takes a very long time for any of that to catch up with Ellen's side of the plot, but eventually it does. There are 2 specific fantasy tropes that this book both relies on very heavily and then subverts a bit in ways that I found to be really interesting. The first is obviously the magical, fabulous, extraordinary bond between the protagonist and some sort of magical creature. There is an extreme amount of wish fulfillment in that trope. And this book does that trope. It's committed to that trope, but then it turns around by the end and reveals that there's something very dark behind it. The royal beasts and the Toda are both suffering the way that they are being kept by the people who keep them in captivity in this kingdom for political ends. But then once Ellen has discovered that there is a better, kinder way to keep these creatures in captivity, it raises even thornier ethical questions about how these animals might be used and whether it was right for humans to think they should keep them at all, especially when it comes to like war and violence. What does it mean when we ask a creature to do that cannot possibly understand what it means? You get to a point come the end of the book where Ellen, who has pursued the caretaking of these creatures in captivity as her life's passion, has sort of come to the realization that it is fundamentally an unethical thing to be doing. The other trope I think this is playing with that I picked up on is a sort of problematic trope that this book sort of sets up and then doesn't do, which is the trope where the protagonist has like ancestry from some mysterious foreign race that has some mysterious magical ability, and therefore the protagonist has some mysterious magical ability that's feared and misunderstood. In this case, Ellen's mother was from this tribe of very secretive people who live in the mountains and are sworn to keep some big secret oath, but she has broken her oath and therefore she lives among Ellen's father's people. And the secret knowledge is that her mother's people are supposedly able to control the Toda and the royal beasts. Ellen ends up rediscovering the means to communicate with these creatures completely by accident, because it isn't actually a magical ability or a fancy heritage that allows her to do it. It's science and animal behavior. And the fact that she figures it out has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that it was like her mother's people's secret. So if those are some tropes you would like to see subverted a bit, I know this is marketed as YA and you'll find it in that section of the bookstore, but it really is, I think, a story that will appeal to adult readers as well, especially if you're actively looking for fantasy in translation, which can be a little hard to come by. The next book I read in September was a reread of Beauty, a retelling of the story of Beauty and the Beast by Robin McKinley. This is, at this point, a classic fairy tale retelling. I struggle to think of a classic-ier classic. This is from 1978. It's not the more interesting or complex of Robin McKinley's two direct Beauty and the Beast retellings. The other one, Rose Daughter, is a more mature novel as I remember it. This is a relatively straightforward and simplistic, kind of bare bones retelling of the story. However, I think this gets a lot of unfair flack from people who come to it these days, having read and seen a lot of more recent adaptations of this fairy tale. I think a lot of people don't give this credit for the things that were innovative about it at the time it was written. I think you have to remember that this significantly predates the animated Disney movie, which then went on to influence how pretty much everyone has approached this fairy tale since. And I have absolutely no way to back this claim up, but I strongly, strongly suspect that someone working on the Disney film was a big fan of this book and stole a number of things from it. There are a number of like smaller details, like the big horse that Beauty has, who is a very good boy. And like if you've read anything of Robin McKinley's that has a horse in it, you know that this is a Robin McKinley thing. And that's definitely in the Disney movie. Also, the first meeting between Beauty and the Beast in this book has a moment in it that definitely feels a lot like that come into the light bit. But then the biggest parallel, of course, is that Robin McKinley made Beauty a bookworm as like her most predominant character trait, and therefore the Beast's library also features very prominently. And if you know Robin McKinley's writing at all, like you also know this is a very Robin McKinley thing. So I always bristle when people nowadays say that this retelling has nothing new or innovative, because I'm like, well, did you check the publication date? This is a nostalgic reread for me. This is a book I grew up with, and so I feel like my ratings when I do nostalgic rereads are pretty much irrelevant for what it's worth. I gave this 4 stars. The things that struck me most on this reread were, one, how absolutely cozy and domestic so much of it is, mostly in the parts that Beauty spends with her family, but also somewhat in the castle with the Beast. And then also the notion of honor as it threads through this book is a very strong element of this retelling. You sort of expect that a Beauty and the Beast retelling will fundamentally be about the concept of beauty and like surface beauty versus the beauty within. McKinley is playing with that a bit in this book by making her protagonist not someone who feels herself to be physically beautiful until she comes into her own later in the novel. Her given name is actually Honor, and Beauty is a childhood nickname that stuck. And I do think she's latching onto something interesting, identifying Honor as an important undercurrent of this fairy tale. It is honor that makes Beauty go to the Beast's castle to hold up her end of her father's bargain. And ultimately in this novel, a sense of honor is the fundamental personality trait that Beauty and the Beast both have in common that makes them a good match. So I think given its place in fantasy history, in the history of retellings of this fairy tale, this book has way more going for it than a lot of people give it credit for. I am glad I reread it. This was a reread that I had sort of been tentatively planning for a long time, but I never actually picked it up until I picked it up on a whim and just like breezed through the entire book. The next book I read, this one was in October, is the first volume of a manga series. This is Magus of the Library, Volume 1 by Mitsu Izumi. This was an absolute impulse, whim library checkout for me. I saw it was the first volume of a thing and it was on the shelf at my library and I picked it up. This feels like a really formulaic beginning for what is either a middle grade-ish or a young adultish fantasy story about a boy who loves books in a world with like magical books and like all sorts of fancy librarians called Kafna. Something that confused me a lot about this when I got it home was that it says it is based on something called Kafna of the Wind by Sophie Schwinn. So I worried like, oh no, is this tie-in media for something that I'm unfamiliar with? Will I be unable to start here? But as far as I can tell, I did some research and Kafna of the Wind is fictional. It doesn't exist. This is saying that it's based on that thing as like a meta-narrative device that I think is unnecessarily confusing. So if you've also looked at this cover and been confused, I think that's what's going on there. There's no reference to Kafna of the Wind by Sophie Schwinn in this first volume, but maybe there will be later on. This was 3 stars for me. There are some things that I really did like about it. However, this first volume seems like it is entirely a prologue to the main story that takes place several years before, where we're presumably going to pick up with Theo in volume 2. And so I don't know if it hooked me enough to ever want to continue. Theo is a young boy who lives in the outskirts of this small town where he lives because he's very poor. I think it's his sister maybe who's taking care of him. I don't quite remember. But because he is from the bad part of town, he is not allowed in the town library, so he sneaks into the library and to read books because he loves books, he loves adventure stories, he dreams that someone is going to come and sweep him away on a grand adventure. Theo also has pointed ears, which like some of the adults in this book recognize mean that he's maybe an elf or something. I forget whether they're called elves in this or not, but he's something. But Theo does not realize this, it's just something that the other kids tease him for. One day, Theo meets a group of Kafna who come to his town. Those, if you will recall, are like the specialized fancy librarians. They come from the main library in the big city, and they are nice to Theo, and they are trying to like solve a mystery about like a missing grimoire or something. He helps them with their mystery, and he sort of thinks that they are his heroes who are going to come sweep him away on a grand adventure, except spoilers, at the end they don't, and that's like the end of the prologue, where presumably he has to grow up a little before he's ready for his grand adventure. So on the plus side, I really liked some of the art in this. There is a lot of detail, both in like some of the landscapes and also in some of like the costuming that some of the characters have. There's also a lot of information we get, largely about the Kafna in this group and their different specialized skills, but also some broader world building. That said, all of that information, that very detailed information, does feel a little bit like an unpleasant info dump when it's presented in a volume that doesn't feel like it's yet moving the main plot forward. So mixed feelings on this. I have renewed this as many times as I'm allowed so I can still have it to hold up for my wrap-up, but it is finally due back at the library in the next few days. So like maybe when I return it, I will see if they have volume 2, and if they happen to have volume 2 on the shelves, I might pick it up, but otherwise I'm not invested enough to like seek out the rest of this series. And then the last book of this wrap-up is the best one of the bunch, I promise. This is The King of Attolia by Megan Whalen Turner, which is the third book in the Queen's Thief series. I have since also read book 4, so I'm going to have to try to keep my thoughts on these separate in my head. But these books are just so excellent, and this was no exception. I've given everything I've read in this series so far 5 stars. Each book in this series sort of takes a different approach to the point of view and perspective that we get on the main cast of characters. This one is predominantly, as the title would suggest, about Eugenides, who I would also argue was the main protagonist of both books 1 and 2. However, he is not the main point of view character. There is a sort of like structural constraint that I've noticed in a bunch of YA, where once a protagonist character is like happily married, they are often not allowed to be like a main point of view character in books going forward if the series is YA. So I wonder if that was part of the reason there is this shift to a younger point of view character. But also it feels totally justified for the approach this book is taking aside from that. The main point of view character in this book is a very young, relatively naive member of the palace guard who is named Costas. And he is sort of a throwaway character. Like, I liked him just fine. He doesn't show up in the next book after this one at all. He himself is not important. The reason he is there is as an outside pair of eyes through which we are seeing Eugenides, a character that we, the reader, know much more about than Costas does, and that is where the fun of this book comes from. Because throughout this book, Eugenides he's playing at something, and we can't tell exactly what, but because we know him, we know he's playing at something. And Costas just doesn't get it at all. And we get the, secondhand satisfaction of like knowing that there's going to be these reveals where Costas is eventually going to figure it out. So to back up, at the very beginning of this book, our young Costas is in a very unfortunate pickle. He has done something very stupid that he should not have done, and he expects to be horribly punished for it. Eugenides takes such advantage of him and ropes him into being like his personal guard, and Costas cannot figure out why. But we sort of can. Costas is a character who is like honest to a fault, because he is not that bright. And this is something that Eugenides can take advantage of. Eugenides is now the king of Attolia. He is pretending to his court to be completely incompetent. They have mostly fallen for it, including the guard, including Costas. And over the course of the book, we see him come into his own as king. This is a court politics novel that is focused almost entirely on the Attolian court. This series has a number of different kingdoms that feature prominently in it, a lot of international politics, war, looming threats, but This book takes a break from all of that to focus inwards on what is happening at the royal court of Attolia and all of its scheming. I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Highly recommend this series. Anyhow, those are the books that I read in those 3 months. September, October, November 2021 that I haven't yet talked about. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope there will be more videos again soon. Anyhow, let me know if you've read any of these books and what you think. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.